Welcome back, everyone. Today was day one of the semifinals of the Chess Global Championship being held in Toronto, Canada. Now, I was matched up against my fellow compatriot, the American Wesley So. In the first game, I start with the white pieces, so away we go. So in the first game, I play e4, Wesley plays e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, and Wesley essays the classic Berlin defense here with knight to f6. Now, I was a little bit surprised by this. Wesley has played the Berlin. He also has played the Petrov, so I wasn't 100% sure. At any rate, I had some ideas, so I played d3, bishop to c5, c3, castles, castles, and now Wesley plays this move d5. This definitely took me by surprise, as this was something that I played in the candidates quite a bit with the black piece, and I figured, you know what, the one game that I lost there was in a very specific variation to Timur Radjabov, so I'm going to play the same line. So I play knight b to d2, Wesley plays pawn to a5 here, and now I play this move pawn to h3. Wesley plays this move pawn takes pawn, I take back, queen to e7 is played, and now I play the move pawn to a4. As I said, this is very similar to my game against Timur Radjabov. In fact, I think up to this point, actually Timur didn't play h3, but very, very similar position, and it's something that I thought was maybe playable for white. So Wesley goes rook d8, I play queen to c2, knight to b8 is played, and now I play rook to e1. Worth noting that black can play knight a7 as well, like I did against Timur in my game, but knight to b8 is a little bit more precise because the knight has this access to potentially going to d7 as well as c6, and from d7 you can potentially go to c5 or to f8, whereas if you put the knight on a7 and white moves the bishop back, for example, you're only looking to go back to the c6 square. You really have no other available options. So knight to b8 is played here by Wesley, and now I play rook to e1, Wesley plays pawn to h6, I go bishop to f1 with the idea of putting my knight maybe on b3 or c4 to target the pawn on e5. The game continues with knight bd7, I play knight to c4 here, and now Wesley plays pawn to b6. Already at this point, I was fairly unhappy with what was going on. I did not like my position. I thought it was much easier for Wesley to play. He can put the bishop on either b7 or a6, and both diagonals are very, very attractive here, and I have some issues finishing my development. So already by this point in the game, I was very, very unhappy, and I wasn't feeling very good about everything. So now I play bishop to e3, Wesley plays bishop b7, I trade the bishops, he takes back with the queen, and now I go rook to b1. Now this also is not a great idea. What I should have probably done here is just played rook d1 with the idea of b3 and then maybe knight d2, and the position is very, very balanced. I wouldn't say that either side has anything here, but I felt like I had to try to create some plays, so I play rook a b1 with the idea of trying to play b4. Wesley goes queen e7, I play b4, and now Wesley finds an excellent move by playing bishop to c6. Now the reason I say this is an excellent move is that in this position, black has some issues here. I'm threatening to take the pawn and win the bishop on b7 potentially. Black also cannot put the knight on c5 because the pawn on b4 prevents that. So by going bishop c6, it forces me into having to make a decision. If I trade the pawns on a5, the a4 pawn is now actually quite weak because black can go knight c5 and target it with both the bishop on c6 as well as the knight on c5. Additionally, there are threats towards the pawn on e4 as well. So I really didn't want to take. Now during the game, I remember at this point I was thinking maybe I should play knight b2, and it's only a little bit worse for white. It shouldn't be that bad. But then I was like, you know what, I'm just going to play b5 because it's probably bad, but maybe I can consolidate my center and it won't matter that black gets this outpost on c5. Now again, after the game, in fact during the game as well, I really was regretting this decision because this is probably just a positional mistake. So Wesley goes bishop b7, I play rook b to d1, and now he plays rook to e8. Again, maybe not the best move, but the idea is very simple. Wesley wants to bring the rook on a8 to d8 and activate it, whereas with the rook e on d8, this rook doesn't really have a great square, and you can't put it on the open file. So Wesley goes rook e8, now I play knight f d2, goes knight c5, and now I play f3, consolidating my center. At the same time, however, I have this permanent weakness on a4 forever, and this knight on c5 is perfectly positioned. So Wesley goes rook a d8, I play knight to b3 here, Wesley trades, and now he puts the other knight on d7, and he wants to move it to c5. So now I go knight to e3, Wesley plays knight c5 here, I go queen to c2, and now Wesley trades some rooks. Now, at this point already here, I was very, very unhappy. Black has this great knight on c5, which always puts pressure on the pawn at a4. I obviously cannot get rid of the knight because I have a light square bishop. And long term, I think that black should be winning. At any rate, fortunately, this is a rapid game, and I continue to just try and play good moves. So I play bishop c4 here, activating the bishop and potentially putting some pressure on the pawn on f7 along the diagonal. h5 is played by Wesley, and now I go bishop d5, trying to trade off some bishops, because if I can trade the bishops and get my knight to d5, my knight on d5 is also very well positioned because it puts a lot of pressure on the pawns on b6 and c7. So Wesley correctly plays bishop c8. I go rook to d2 here. He plays queen g5, and now I have to go king f2 because if I were to move the knight to say f1, black can take the pawn on h3 due to the pin. So I go king f2, sidestepping the pin, and then also guarding the knight on e3 as well. Game continues with rook d6 here, and now I play queen to d1. Wesley goes to h4, and I play king to e2. And now he plays a move that I think is the start of an inaccurate plan. Wesley plays king f8 here. I was actually very concerned about moves like g6 and f5 potentially. Maybe not in this exact position, but at some point g6 and f5 really concerned me. And he goes king f8, I play queen c2, and now he plays king e7. And again, I think this idea of g6 and f5 with potentially f4 opening up the center of the board is very, very scary to play against, and I'm really not sure what I would have done here to potentially save the game. I think there's a good chance that I would have lost had Wesley played g6. At any rate, he goes king e7, and now I play rook d1, bishop to d7, and now I play bishop b3. And again, I'm still worse in this position, but the problem for black now is that I'm going to be able to put the knight on d5. Major pieces are coming off the board with the rooks, and additionally, in the long run, if I can put the bishop on c2, the bishop is very passive, but it will always guard the pawn on a4, and it's not going to be a super weakness. And with only queens on the board and no rooks to put on the open d file, this should be pretty salvageable for me. So Wesley plays bishop to e6 here, and now I trade. He takes with the pawn, of course, to stop me from being able to jump with the knight to either d5 or f5. I trade the rooks here, which is also a slight mistake. Perhaps I should have played knight g4 here. And after black goes queen f4, I can actually already just start to sit with knight e3, knight g4, and there are no issues. Whereas in the game, when I trade the rooks on d6, there's nothing wrong with it, but black can maybe try to push d5 at some point. So I play queen d1, Wesley goes queen g3, and now we do a little bit of shuffle. Queen c2, king d7, queen d1, king c7, queen c2, queen g5, queen d1, queen g6, king f1, queen f6, king e2. Of course, I don't want to hang the pawn at e4 because of the pin. So I go king e2, queen g5, queen c2, queen f4, queen d1, which, by the way, is also potentially a mistake here. Now, as soon as I played queen d1, I realized that there was this possibility for Wesley to play d5, and after takes, there's queen takes a4. Again, very tricky to play this, though, because on first glance, you feel like white's getting this pawn going to e7. There's knight f5 to win the pawns on g7 or h4, and it feels a little bit iffy. So Wesley does not do that. Perhaps he should have done that, which is why here I probably should have played c4 just to permanently prevent black from ever pushing d5. And even if black hits the pawn at g5, you can never push. So I can just always sit with the queen on c2 and d1 and make a draw. Also, this knight would love to get to d4, but there are no access points. The knight cannot go to e6 or b3 here. So instead I play queen d1, Wesley plays queen g3, I go queen c2, queen g5, queen d1, queen g6, and now we make a repetition here, and the first game ends in a draw. After this opening, I was very, very fortunate. I was relieved that I was able to salvage the draw, because in a match format, if you lose the first game with white, that means you're going to have 4 blacks and 3 whites remaining, and you're down a point, so the odds are definitely not in your favor. So the first game ends in a draw, and we'll now move on to the second game. So in the second game, I'm playing with the black pieces. Wesley opens with e4, I play e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and now I2 essay the Berlin defense. Wesley plays d3, bishop c5, c3, castles, castles, and I2 play d5, and we have the exact same opening from the first game of the match. Wesley plays knight d2, I trade, I go a5, plays a4, queen e7, and now Wesley plays the move queen c2. I played h3 in the first game of the match, but Wesley plays queen c2, and now I go knight b8, simply trying to follow what Wesley did by putting the knight on b8 as opposed to a7. Game continues with rook e1, and now I play rook d8. After I played this move, I was not particularly happy with myself. I felt that in this position, I could have possibly played bishop e6, because if white takes on e5, there is this idea with bishop f2 and queen c5 check, winning the knight on e5, and black should be okay here. Again, at low depth, computer thinks that white is better, but I do believe that this should be close to equal. Instead, I play rook d8, Wesley goes knight f1, and now I have my first issue here, which is that I'd love to put the bishop on e6 and then bring my knight into the game, whereas if I put the knight on d7 right away, now the bishop is blocked and I can't activate it easily. But the problem is if I go bishop e6 here, white can now take the pawn, because if I try to go for bishop f2, the queen captures and there's no queen c5 check anymore. So after a bit of a think, I decided to play c6 here. Wesley goes bishop c4, and now I play h6 to prevent white from going knight g5 and putting pressure on the pawn on f7. Wesley plays knight g3, and now I find a nice move by going knight g4, targeting his own pawn on f2 with the knight on g4, as well as the bishop on c5. Wesley plays rook f1, and now I go bishop e6. And already at this point, I was feeling very optimistic because now I'm going to be able to complete my development here with moving the knight to d7 or a6. I have a rook on an open file as well, and white has some issues, so my bishop on c5 is better than his dark square bishop on c1. So I was already feeling optimistic. Wesley was actually shaking his head as well, so I knew things were going well. So Wesley plays h3 here. I go knight to f6. He plays rook b1, and now I play knight b to d7. He goes b4. I play bishop f8, bishop e3, finishing his own development and putting his bishop on a nice diagonal. But now I found this nice move b5. And the reason I was so happy to find this move is for a couple of reasons. First of all, once I go b5, there are going to be a lot of pawns exchanged. There's no risk of me losing the game, first of all, which is very good when you're playing with the black pieces. Secondly, I think in the resulting pawn structure, white's pawn on c3 will be weaker than my pawn on b5, so I was feeling very good about this. So Wesley trades all the pawns, goes queen b3, and now I play queen c6, targeting the pawn on not c3, sorry, but targeting the pawn on e4 here, and white has to be very, very careful. So Wesley plays rook fd1, and now I play a move that I thought during the time made sense, which is rook e8. The reason behind rook e8 here is that I intend to go knight c5, and I figure with the rook on e8, I guard the pawn on e5. So say white plays a random move and I go knight c5, the pawn on e5 will never be hanging because the rook guards it. Now, in retrospect, I probably should have gone rook c8, putting pressure on the pawn on c3, because the idea of knight c5 isn't really going to be necessary, and additionally, the knight on f6 guards that knight, and the knight also on d7 also guards the pawn on e5. So I probably should not have gone rook e8. In fact, after the game, I really regretted this decision. So I play rook e8, Wesley plays queen c2, and now I go knight to c5, and he plays knight e2, which is a mistake. In this position, Wesley should have traded on c5 and played something like queen e2 here, which would have actually been very similar to the game. And the problem here is that I have this pawn on b5 that's always a little bit weak. The rook on e8 is tied down to the pawn on e5, and my knight on f6 isn't really threatening the pawn on e4, so it's very hard for me to do anything here, and most likely there's probably going to be a swap of the b5 pawn for the c3 pawn. So, at any rate, Wesley plays knight e2, which is a mistake here, and now I missed my one opportunity in the second game. I play rook a4. What I should have done here is I should have played knight to a4, and after white plays a move like rook b3, there's sort of this counterintuitive move knight f to d7, with the idea of maybe going knight c5 or even potentially rook c8 here, and the computer gives black a fairly substantial advantage. During the game, it obviously didn't seem obvious to me, and therefore I didn't play it. Instead, I played rook a4, continuing with one of the themes that I thought here, which is that after bishop takes c5, bishop takes c5, I figured I've got this awesome bishop on c5, a lot of threats on this diagonal, e4 pawn is a little bit weak, and therefore I should be much better. Unfortunately for me, the problem is that after queen d3, this b5 pawn is super soft, so I don't really have time to set up a position where I'm going to be able to play like bishop a7 and queen c5 or queen b6, because white can just trade the queens on b5 immediately. And if I go rook a5, then white can play knight b3 and trade the knight for the bishop, and then I have no advantage at all. So after queen d3, I play rook b8 to guard the pawn, but now Wesley plays knight f3, targeting the pawn on e5, and now you see I can't move the rook back to e8 because then I lose the pawn on b5, and white has completely equalized already. So here I play rook a2 after a long think. Initially, one of the moves that I thought about playing was something like h5, because if white goes knight takes e5, I can go for this tactic again with bishop f2 and queen c5 to win the knight on e5. So I thought about h5, but then I rejected it because I realized it doesn't actually threaten anything. h4 is not a threat because white can take the pawn here. The other move I considered was knight takes e4, but unfortunately after knight takes e4, queen takes e4, white can play, I guess, rook takes b5 is one move, but I think queen takes e4, rook d5 is the simplest way to equalize here, and black is going to lose both the e5 and the b5 pawns, probably win the c3 pawn, but it will peter out into a draw. So after a long think, I play rook a2, Wesley plays rook d2, we trade, and again, if I play knight takes e4, if I don't play knight takes e4, it's very hard to protect the pawn on e5 and also try to put pressure on c3. If I go rook e8, white can go queen d3 again, and I have the same issue where my rook on e8 cannot guard both pawns on e5 and b5 here. So after a bit of a think and queen takes d2 is played, I decide, you know what, it's time to bail out. I play knight takes e4, we trade the knights, Wesley plays rook e1, winning back the pawn on e5, queen to b7, rook e5, queen c7, queen e2, and now I played bishop f8 and offered a draw. The game would have continued probably with rook takes b5, rook takes b5, queen takes b5, queen takes c3. Both sides have the same number of pawns, they're on the same side, and there's just nothing really to play for. So the second game ends in a draw, and now we move to the third game. In the third game, playing with the white pieces again, I start by playing e4. Wesley plays e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. Again, another Berlin. We got the same setup where Wesley plays d5, and now I decide to deviate by trading pawns on d5. Wesley takes, I go bishop to c4 here, and now Wesley plays this move, queen to d8. So after queen to d8 is played here, in this position, I decide to play knight b to d2. Wesley plays a5, stopping me from getting some queenside expansion with b4 and a4. Play h3 to stop maybe knight g4 and or potentially bishop g4 as well. h6, rook e1, rook to e8 is played, and now I go queen to e2 here. Wesley plays a4, and after a bit of a think, I decide to play knight e4 and simplify the game. Now, this is not a bad move per se, but the problem is that after knight e4, the position really becomes very stale with a symmetrical pawn structure and not a whole lot of play for either side. So Wesley goes bishop e6, trying to trade off my powerful bishop on c4, and he still has his powerful bishop on c5. I play rook to b1 here with the idea of playing b4. I could not do it right away, so I go b4 here. Black can play en passant with pawn takes pawn, and I cannot recapture the pawn because then I would lose my rook on a1. So I play rook to b1 here. Wesley goes queen to f6. Now I play b4. We trade bishops. He goes bishop b6. Now I play b4, knight to e7, and I go bishop e3. Again, at this point, his bishop on b6 is very, very powerful, and I want to exchange it. So I play bishop e3, knight g6 is played, and now I trade. And here I was actually surprised because Wesley took instantly with the queen. I thought pawn takes was maybe an idea because black can go for knight to f4 here. I cannot play g3 because then I lose my knight on f3. And I was just a little bit concerned about this, although it shouldn't really be anything special for black, but it feels a touch scary. At any rate, Wesley captures with the queen, and now I go g3, restricting the knight on g6 where it cannot go to f4. And after queen to whoops, well, I didn't mean to do that, spoiler alert. But after queen to e6 and we trade queens, this position really is drawish. Now, neither side has a whole lot going on. So I'm going to go fairly fast through the endgame because it was a very, very long endgame. I play h4, Wesley goes rook a3, rook e3, he plays h5, stopping me from pushing or removing the knight. He's also going to go f6 and consolidate his pawn chain as well. Rook d3, f6, knight d2, rook c6, rook c1. We maneuver some pieces here. And at this point, we get this critical moment right here, where after king d1, Wesley plays this move c6. In this position, Wesley plays c6 so that he could threaten to take the pawn on c3. If he takes right away, there's knight d5 fork, winning the rook on c3. And so he played c6 without really thinking, and now I instantly played king c2. And as soon as I played king c2, I realized, like, wait a second, there was actually this knight f5 check here, which would have been very strong, because after king to e8, I have rook d6 with the infiltration, and after king f7, rook d7, king f8. This should be, I think king c2, white should be better here. I don't know if this is clearly winning or not, but black is under a lot of pressure. So instead I played king c2 instantly, Wesley checks, we trade, and now the game should be a draw. Wesley plays b5, I go here, g6, knight c2, and now Wesley makes a blunder. Blunder maybe is too strong of a word, but he makes a mistake by playing g5. When I spoke to Wesley after the match concluded today, Wesley said he played g5 because he simply missed knight e3. He thought that, or not knight e3, sorry. He missed that I had knight to f5 check here, because after I go knight to f5 and I take on h4 with the knight, now black has a weak pawn on h5 and my pawn structure is still intact, more or less. Wesley goes knight g7, knight f3, we make a bunch of maneuvering moves. We get this critical moment, we keep maneuvering, maneuver, and now finally I play f4 and knight h4, and the idea here is long term. I maybe want to go f5 or trade on e5, knight d6, king d3, king e6. We do more shuffling, and now I play this f5 move. Now, this is not a move that I want to play, but I do have to be careful, because if I go like knight f3 here, for example, black can maybe play f5, and there are potentially some issues where this pawn could become an outside pass pawn. So I play f5 here, Wesley goes king f7, I go knight f3, we do a lot of shuffling again. And actually right around here, Wesley makes a mistake. What he should have played is he should have played this counterintuitive move king g7, because after knight e5, king h6, knight takes c6, king g5, black's king is coming in here, and this pawn is going to be very, very fast going down the board. So king g7 would have been a very, very good move. After king g7, I probably would have gone knight c5 and knight e6 to restrict the king from getting in. But in this position, black can play h4, or even I think knight to b7, and this still should be a draw, or knight c4 as well. And I don't really know how I'm supposed to play for a win. At any rate, Wesley goes king e7, but now after knight c5, black has to be very, very careful here, because the idea for me is quite simple. If black plays a move like knight f7 and I go knight e6, the idea is to go knight to g7, and win the pawn on h5. And also, if black plays a move like knight c8, knight e6 here, you cannot go king to f7, stopping knight g7, because then I go the other way to d8 with the fork of the king on f7, as well as the pawn on c6. So Wesley plays knight e8, I go knight to e6, dominating the knight on e8, because if he ever moves, I have knight g7, collecting the pawn on h5. King d7 is played, we do a little bit of shuffling, and now I play c4 here, and Wesley has to take the pawn. If you don't take the pawn, I think this is actually lost, because after king e7, c5, you no longer have access to the d6 square, and now your knight is actually completely stuck on e8 here, and white can probably just win very simply. If king f7, there's knight d8 to win the pawn, and if you go king d7, I slowly walk my king over, and eventually my king will come to h4, and I will gobble the pawn on h5 and win the game. So black has to take, knight d6 is played, king d3, Wesley goes back to stop knight g7, I play king e3, he goes king e7, and we do a lot of shuffling once again all over the board here. Wesley is holding this very, very comfortably, and now I slowly bring my king all the way back around, and again we get this position, not a whole lot is happening. And I go here, and now Wesley plays this move king d8, which is a mistake here. He's been defending for a long time up to this point. If he had played knight e8, this would have been a draw, but Wesley slips up and he goes king d8, which is a huge mistake, because now I have knight e6 check and knight to g7, collecting the pawn on h5. Wesley plays knight b5, I take, he goes king f7, and now I make a blunder, which it's still winning after my next move, but it's not the best move. Now, both of us were low on time, so I just played g4 instinctively to protect the knight and then try to create a square for the knight to come back, because when I'm looking at this with only seconds on the clock, my knight is stuck here. I can't go to g7 or f4. King covers the g7 square, the pawn on e5 covers f4, so g4 makes sense. Maybe I can go g5, but I also create space for the knight to get back into the game. However, in this position, the winning line that I should have played was I should have actually done a ziggy-zaggy with king d2, knight to d6, and now I go king to d3, and the knight has to move. If black moves the king, now my knight gets back to e6 from g7, and if the knight goes to, say, b5, now I run up with the king, and after knight d6, king c5, knight e4, king c6, followed by b5, b6, b7, this will be a very easy win for white. Instead, I play g4, out of reaction, knight d6 is played, and now I go knight g3, king g7, I check again, I go king e3, knight b5, and now I make a mistake. I play knight g3. What I should have done here is, again, I should have done the ziggy-zaggy with king d2, and black has to move something. If you move the king, the knight gets in. You obviously can't go to f8, because then you lose the pawn on f6, so the king is stuck on f7, so black has to move the knight, but after knight d6, king d3, now you're going to have to move the knight, and when you move the knight away, the same thing where the king gets in, and white should be winning. So it's very sad that I didn't play this, but again, both of us were very low on time here, and I just played knight g3 instead. King g7 is played, and now I blunder with knight e2. I still could have gone knight h5, king f7, and then found king d2, king d3, but I played knight e2 instead. King h6 is played, and now I go king f3, king g5, king g3, knight to d6, knight c3, and now Wesley actually makes a surprising blunder here. He plays this move, knight c4. In this position, the correct move is to go king h6, and after king h4, knight f7, white is still better, but black can blockade by putting the knight on g5, targeting the pawn on e4. Instead, Wesley plays the very human knight c4, and now I miss another chance to win the game. I play b5 here. Now, in this position, if I had found the very unusual move knight to a4, this is actually close to winning, because if black goes knight to d2, I have knight c5 here, and if black goes knight to f1, I have king... I think I have king f3, knight h2, king g2, knight g4, and then I go knight to e6 check, king h5, and I have knight to d8, winning this pawn on c6 here. So this would have probably still been winning. Again, it's very tricky to spot, but the reason it's winning versus what I did in the game is that once I play b5 and we eliminate the queenside pawns, black can now go knight e3, take the pawn, and there's no threat here of me perhaps getting an outside pass pawn and winning that pawn on c6. So the game ends in a draw more or less here after knight g4. We play a few more moves, nothing too special, and inevitably this third game ends in a draw. So after 3 games, we're deadlocked, 1.5, 1.5, and now we move on to the fourth and final game of the day where I'm playing with the black pieces. So in this fourth and final game, Wesley plays e4 again. We get e5, knight f3, knight c6, and now Wesley changes it up. Instead of going to the Berlin, he decides to play the classic Gucci piano with bishop c4. I play knight f6, d3, bishop c5, all very standard. Get castles d6, c3, a6, rook e1, castles, a4, bishop a7, b4. I play h6, creating the lift for the king, also stopping knight g5 or bishop g5. Wesley plays knight bd2. I go rook to e8 here. Very straightforward idea to play bishop e6 and trade the light square bishops, and then play d5 to perhaps imbalance the center of the board. So we get knight f1, bishop to e6, we trade our bishops, bishop e3, we trade some more bishops, and now we're playing a game of D's knights. So I go knight to e7 here, Wesley plays queen c2, I go knight g6. I could have maybe played d5 here, but you're never really sure, because after takes knight c4, you worry that this pawn on e5 is going to be very weak. If I play f6, white can maybe even go d4 here, and it just doesn't look very good. Now, amazingly, in this position, black is actually better, because you have rook c6, and there's a lot of pressure towards the knight on c4 and the pawn on c3. But again, in a rapid game, if you're not familiar with the idea, it will be almost impossible to spot this. So instead I play knight g6, and the idea is quite straightforward now. If white plays a move like h3 and I get d5 after takes, now the knight guards the pawn, so when white plays knight c4, I can play something simple. I guess queen f6 or even queen e7 are simple moves that guard the pawn on e5. So Wesley plays c4, preventing me from playing d5. I play c6 here, Wesley goes a5, and now I play d5 anyway, and now Wesley plays this move c5. Now, at first glance, this looks very ugly because it closes the whole queen side of the board here. On the other hand, however, there's still a lot going on in the center. White can trade the pawns and put pressure on e5. Additionally, if I ever go d4, the knight can jump to either f5 or c4, and potentially to d6 as well. So white is actually quite a bit better here. So I play knight e8 after a short think. Idea very simple. The knight on f6 is not doing a whole lot. The pawn on e4 is very well protected here. And by going knight e8, I have a long-term plan of trying to put my knight on b5 and maybe contest the d4 square, or maybe push d4 and go knight c3 later on. So Wesley plays g3. I go knight c7, plays rook a d1. I go knight to b5. He plays queen b2. And now I make a mistake. I play this move d4, which, again, move that makes some sense, because when I play d4, I can play knight to c3. Also, my knight on b5 covers the d6 square, so if white goes to c4, there's no access. Even from f5, no access, because the knight holds the square. However, in this position, what I probably should have played was I probably should have just played rook back to e8. And now if white plays a move like knight to f5, I can play queen d7, followed by rook a d8. And I really should have no issues at all in this position. Instead, I played d4, but now after knight to f5, I play this move knight to e7, Wesley plays knight h4, we swap the knights, and now I make a mistake here by playing this move pawn to h5. Again, my whole concept was very straightforward. I figured that in this position I can play h5, followed by g6 to kick the knight out of f5, and I thought with the knight coming to c3, I should be completely fine. How very wrong I was. So Wesley plays rook f1, I go g6, knight h4, and now I play this move knight to c3. Again, the knight on b5 feels like it's out of play. From c3, you can maybe hop to e2, and so it just seems like the right square to be on, and it is a nice outpost. However, after rook to e1, I go queen e7, and now Wesley finds the best move in the position, pawn to f4. Already here, I was very unhappy, because the problem is after takes, if white... Or actually, as I was thinking about this position, I was very unhappy, because the initial line that I saw was takes, f5, and I thought this was okay, but then on second glance, after queen to f2, I was very concerned, because if I play knight to d5 here, which looks like a very nice move, white cannot take the knight because you lose the rook on e1. If white goes rook f3, I just take the pawn on e4, and again, I'm much better here. But the problem is there's a very nasty move, knight takes g6 here, attacking the queen. And if I play rook takes knight, now white can take the knight because the queen on f2 guards the rook on e1. And I'm not in time to take the rook on f4 because knight takes e7 is very unfortunately checked, so I don't have time to play knight h3, forking the king on g1 and the queen on f2. So as soon as f4 was played, I think at this moment we started about 8 minutes. I think we had about 8.5 minutes each. I used about 5 minutes here before playing pawn takes pawn. And I was very unhappy. In fact, after rook takes f4, I think what I was going to do is I was going to go knight d5, rook f2, and knight e3. And I was just hoping that after queen d4, knight g4, rook d2, rook d8, that I would have something here with my knight coming to e5, maybe f5 as well, but I really wasn't sure what was going on. Computer actually thinks that white is much better, but this is what I was going to play as I had spotted the queen f2 idea. Now, to my horror, when I took, Wesley instantly played this move knight f3, which I had not even considered at all. Now, this is actually not a great move. It's a mistake objectively, but by this point, I'm already down on time, and I'm very unsure of what's going on, and it really flustered me. So after a bit of a think, I take on g3 here, and Wesley takes on d4. Now, in this position, I end up making a mistake. I play this move knight to b5. It's worth noting that the computer line, which saves the game, is pawn takes pawn. I did actually see this line with king h1, knight takes e4, but I rejected it because after knight takes rook, knight g3, white does not have to capture the pawn at h2, because then I take the rook with check and I capture the knight and win the game. But white can go king g2 sidestepping here, and at this point I just stopped looking at the line because I realized that here, if I go knight f1, there's queen g7, which is checkmate, and I thought it was losing. However, again, our silicon friends proved that the black is completely fine after h1, rook takes h1, and this very unusual move, pawn takes knight, because now if white takes on g3, you go queen g5 check. If king h2, you check. King cannot go to g1, because then you lose the rook on e1. And after king g2, queen g4, king also cannot run to the f file, because then I bring my rook to f8, which is why you capture the knight with on e6 with pawn on f7, and after king e3, queen f4, king e2, queen f2, you will win the queen on b2. So this would have been the safest way to draw the game. Actually, after takes, white should probably trade here and go knight f3, and with 4 pawns temporarily, probably soon to be 3 pawns, but the queen side completely locked like this, it should be a pretty easy draw. Instead, I play a practical move. I decide to go knight b5 here. Now, one thing that people have to realize about rapid chess is that when you're really low on time, there are certain situations where it's not even about what the best move is. It's about a situation where you can play a lot of moves very quickly, and there isn't a lot to think about. So when I played knight to b5 here, Wesley took. I took back on e6. Perhaps I could have taken this pawn, by the way, but I was worried about something like rook f6 and rook f1 and queen f2 with a legendary triple stack. So I thought, you know what? I'm just going to take the knight on e6, and after pawn takes pawn, I go rook d8. Now, what I was saying about making practical decisions is that in this position, I'm down a whole rook for a knight, but white's pawns are a little bit weak. They're blockaded on the queen side, and I can also put my knight on d4, the knight's outpost, and it's very clear what I want to do. If I have 5 moves to set it up, I'll just show you guys how I do it. If I get to this position already here, it's very close to equal because I can just sit forever with rook f8, rook f7, and I know computer gives white an advantage, but it's not really clear what the plan is exactly. So if I get this setup, I can just play all these moves without having to think, and then Wesley's the one who's going to have to think and use all his time. So that's why I made this decision, because I figured at this point it's all about making practical moves and figuring it out. So here Wesley plays rook d1, which is a mistake. In this position, if Wesley had played rook f6, he probably would have won the game, because after queen g4, there's this very nice move rook to e3 here, and if I play h4, Wesley and I were discussing this after the game, there's rook to f4, queen to d1, and white can go rook f1, queen g4, and now there's a very nice move queen to f6, winning either the pawn on h4 or the pawn on f7. Probably have to go rook d7, queen h4, and white should be winning here. Instead, Wesley plays rook d1, which is a passive move. Now I go knight d4, of course, trying to set up my dream position. Wesley goes king g2, and now I play king g7. And as soon as Wesley played rook f2, I was again very unhappy with myself, because I felt like in this position I probably should have been able to go queen e5 and f6 and get my dream setup with rook f8. Computer apparently thinks that I'm not in time anyway, but I felt like I should have been able to set this up. And then when I played king g7 and Wesley went rook f2, I realized I'm not in time, because if I go f6, rook f1, I cannot go rook f8 to guard the pawn, because then I lose the knight on d4. So I'm one move short here, whereas if I could just plant the queen on e5 and get rook f8, I'd be completely fine. So here I go rook d7, Wesley plays rook f1, and now I go queen e5, and I just figure I set up a defensive pawn with the rook, and I have the queen on e5 and the knight on d4 and a nice little blockade. So rook f4 is what Wesley plays, and now I find a nice move knight to f3 with limited time on the clock. Important move too, because white wants to line up the classic legendary triple stack with queen f2, and this is the only way to sort of prevent it in a sense, but also reroute my knight to a square where it guards the pawn on f7, and now my rook permanently will be targeting this pawn on d3. So queen e2 is played, I go knight to g5, Wesley plays rook d1, and now I play rook to d4. Different blockade here, but the ideas are more or less the same. I put pressure on the pawn on b4. White cannot push d4, and I can always go knight e6 to reinforce the rook on d4. The other problem for white to deal with here is that I have some nasty tricks. Like if white goes queen b2 here, I can play rook takes e4, and white cannot take the rook because then you would lose the queen. And if you trade the queens, now black has some chances to win because I maintain a light square blockade, and I can also bring the knight back to e6 here. So Wesley plays queen e1 here, trying to guard, but now I go knight to e6. Maybe not the best move. Probably I should have just played queen e6 on the spot, but I play knight e6, rook f3, knight g5. Wesley goes back, and now I spot the idea with queen e6 to either go queen a2 / b3 and go after the pawn on b4, or to go towards h2 with the knight on g5, supporting the queen. So here Wesley plays rook f1. I check. He goes king g1. And now I play this move, rook takes b4. If I had more time, there's a good chance I would have played something like queen g4 here to keep the game going. But with very little time on the clock, I thought rook takes b4 was a very obvious move, because now if white doesn't take the rook, I have a knight and a pawn for the rook. Also, I can go rook b5 or rook b2 to create mating threats. A knight on g5, it's very scary. Also, g3 is very weak. White's rooks and queen are extremely passive here. So I was very happy when I spotted this move, and I just played it. Wesley correctly takes the rook, and now the game ends in a draw after queen g3, king h1, queen h3. It's worth noting, knight to f3 looks like a nice little try, but unfortunately this doesn't work. If white were to take the knight, I could take the rook, of course, classic mini pyramid of Giza, and I win the rook on d1. If white goes like rook d2, I go queen h3 check. King cannot slide over because the knight on f3 covers g1. And after rook h2, queen h2, this would be, I think, the Arabian checkmate or close to it, or some version of it. But the problem is after knight f3, white can go queen b2 check, king g8, and now white can play rook f2 here. And after queen h3, rook h2, knight takes h2. White has a very devious move, which is not to take the knight on h2, because then again after queen f3, I collect the rook on d1. But white can play queen g2 here, and if I move the queen anywhere, white will capture because there's no queen f3 check. And if I go to like e3, white takes with the king, of course. And if I have to trade the queens after knight g4, rook b1, white will gobble on b7, win the a or c pawns, and make a new queen, and this will be a complete disaster. So after queen takes b4 is played, without any hesitation, I just take and I make the repetition immediately. And this fourth and final game of the match between Wesley So and myself here in the semifinals of the Chess Global Championship in Toronto ends in a draw. So we're all square, 2-2 after 4 games. I'm perhaps a little bit disappointed with game 3, which I probably should have won. On the other hand, I very easily could have lost I could have lost game 1 or game 4. So a 2-2 score seems fairly balanced and correct. And we have 4 more games tomorrow. I will obviously be doing another recap after the match. We'll see how it goes, but that's all for now, you guys. So I hope you enjoyed this recap of the first day of the 8-game semifinal match between myself and Wesley So here in Toronto. Make sure to hit that subscribe button if you've not already, and I'll be back with another recap tomorrow. Hope you guys have a good one. Bye.